Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to take a moment to discuss an amendment that I think is relevant to this discussion. And I want to thank my colleague, Senator McCaskill, for her work on this topic. And it goes to the issue of the integrity by which this body and Congress in general operates, which certainly is a central issue regarding this particular bill. Our amendment goes to a particular aspect of the integrity of this body. And my concern is, in the absence of our amendment, many of our colleagues will likely resume a very wasteful, non-transparent process which is prone to corruption itself and abuse, and that's the process of earmarking. And so I want to speak a little bit about earmarks and what they are and why I think we ought to have a permanent legislative ban on the process. And let me be clear about the process. Earmarks exist precisely in order to circumvent any real scrutiny, transparency, or any process by which this body, our other body, or the American people can evaluate the merits of a given project. There's no authorization to earmarks. There's no proper scrutiny. There's no competitive bidding among competing demands for resources. I think the process itself is indefensible. And in part because the process is so badly flawed, we shouldn't be surprised that it leads to extraordinary waste. And we've seen it. Some of the earmarks have become famous because they're so wasteful and inappropriate. We all heard about the bridge to nowhere. Recent earmarks include, above and beyond that, $1 million salmon products earmark. There was $1.9 million earmarked for the Charles Rangel Center for Public Service, requested by none other than Congressman Charles Rangel. $550,000 for a glass museum, $2.5 million for Arctic Winter Games. The list goes on and on and on. I could go on all day with indefensible projects that got into law, taxpayer dollars that were spent precisely because these earmarks were permitted. Mr. President, I would argue that it has gotten to the point where it really adds up to real dollars and cents. I know there are those who want to resume earmarking who like to suggest that, well, it's not a big number. It doesn't really add up to a whole lot of money. Well, over the course of the last 15 years, the total value of taxpayer dollars spent this way has tripled. And in the last Congress, it reached $36 billion. You know, one of the other things that I think is particularly pernicious about earmarks is that over time they became a currency that's used to buy votes. Because there's this unwritten law that if you ask for an earmark in a spending bill and you get it, you're obligated to vote for that bill regardless of how bloated, inappropriate, wasteful, or otherwise nonsensical that bill might be. That's a really terrible process. And finally, the fact is, it's an opportunity for corruption. I'm not suggesting that there's corruption involved in most earmarks. I'm sure there's not. But we do know some examples of some of our colleagues who, in fact, did use earmarks quite inappropriately to enrich themselves. I know of one who's in jail right now because of that. And while that is certainly the very unusual exception, the fact is a process like that is badly flawed and should be remedied. Now, as we all know, there is a current temporary moratorium in place on earmarks that has been adopted by both bodies and both parties. But that temporary moratorium expires. And so what our amendment does is it creates a permanent legislative ban on earmarks. And it does that by creating a point of order. Any senator can come down to the Senate floor and strike an earmark if one is inserted in a spending bill. And it would take a 2/3 vote of the Senate to override the effort to strike the earmark. It's important to note that this amendment does not strike the entire bill. It wouldn't invalidate the bill or otherwise disrupt the bill. It would surgically remove the earmark that would be offending this point of order. So as I say, I want to thank Senator McCaskill for her support in this. I want to thank Senator Coburn for the many years in which he has battled, as have others, and especially Senator McCain and others. But you know, Senator Coburn once described earmarks as the gateway drug to spending addiction. And I think he's really on to something with that characterization. See, I think it's time that we change the culture in Washington, that we change the culture of Congress. Get away from a culture that says how can we maximize spending, which really has been the culture of Congress for way too long, and move to a culture that says, how do we maximize savings? Because when we're running trillion-dollar annual deficits, we've got to find savings everywhere we can, and I can't think of a better place to start. So if we really want to change Washington, if we really want to reduce wasteful spending, if we really want to eliminate opportunities for corruption, if we really want to change the culture of spending and begin in the process of doing these things to hopefully restore some of the American people's confidence in their government, one of the ways we can do this very constructively is to pass this amendment. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Well, I want to thank Senator Toomey for joining with me and been a great leader on this since he's arrived in the Senate in terms of the fight against earmarks. I want to thank him for that. I also want to welcome him to our band of warriors in terms of fighting the earmark culture in Washington. It has been a fairly small number of senators since I arrived here in January of 2007. And I'll be honest, the senator has spent some time in the House, so he was more familiar with the process of earmarking than I was when I came to the Senate. I didn't really understand how it worked. I didn't really get it. And I don't think until you've gotten here and watched it from the inside that you truly appreciate how flawed this is in terms of a way of distributing public money. It really is going in the back room and sprinkling fairy dust. It really is a process that has more to do with who you are and who you know than merit. Now, have there been lots of projects that have been funded that I've supported? Of course. And did I make a decision, a difficult one, to not cherry pick certain earmarks during my career to go after with amendments on the floor? Instead, I have tried from the day I got here and realized the process to reform the process. Not just to say, oh, let's find this one earmark in this bill and gin up an amendment on it, but rather let's try to stop the process in its entirety because it makes no sense. And that's what this amendment does. It actually will stop the process in its entirety. Now, why do we need it if we have a moratorium now? I mean, frankly, when I first started saying I wanted to do away with all earmarking, I was laughed at by members of this body, directly and indirectly. And sometimes I felt like people were patting me on the head and saying, now go away, you have no chance to do this. And I'm proud of the fact that we've gotten a moratorium now. But the truth is that there are a lot of members of this body that want to go back to the old ways. And I think it's very important that we do a permanent ban. And I certainly thank the senator for helping with this. And I think the amendment that we are working on together will make sure that we don't have what happened in the House this year. Sure.
Senator from Pennsylvania.